Welcome back to Coffee and Cream, a podcast where we are changing the narrative one cup of coffee at a time. My name is Jake, and I'm here with Matt Bryant.
What is happening, man?
What's going on? You doing good?
Oh, yeah, bro. I'm feeling real good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're feeling really good.
Yeah. 6 hours of sleep, man. It was great. That's awesome.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's pretty good.
It's more than I usually get.
That should be like another podcast where we talk about sleep patterns.
People been... let's just move on. Because people have been convicting me of that lately. So, yeah.
Yeah, so as people have probably already seen from the video, but we have a guest with us here.
Yeah.
But before we introduce him, we got to introduce our brand new sponsor. So we've had JM Film sponsoring us for a while. They're still sponsoring us. But we have a new sponsor for us. They are Switch Coffee. Ta-da! An actual coffee sponsor. We are so excited to partner with Switch Coffee. Matt, do you want to talk a little bit about Switch since you had a lot of interactions with them?
Yeah, first of all, their coffee is phenomenal.
Amazing. Okay. We're drinking it now.
Yeah, what is it? We got the Papua New Guinea. So I can't even it wants me to cry for joy, like cry in enjoyment. It's really good coffee. But Switch is more than just coffee. They actually have a very similar mission statement to ours. Yeah. Of creating dialogue over a cup of coffee. Yeah. And so they recently started up not too long ago. They were actually relatively new to the St. Louis scene, and right now they're getting their product out there. They don't have a store just yet, but they do wholesale, and so you can go online to switchcoffee.co and purchase there, and they can just ship it to you. But they are big in partnering with people that want to see neighborhoods, more particularly in the north side of St. Louis, changed. And so one of their partners they work with right now, and like just kind of starting up a little bit, is with churches in that area and partnerships in there. And they have a lot of ties with Mission St. Louis and all that, and a couple churches sell their coffee. But just having a dialogue with the guys, they are genuinely excited about creating conversations about race and racism that brings people together. Yeah.
And so we thought this is a perfect partnership for Coffee and Cream and Switch Coffee. So we're really excited to see what the future holds with them and us, and hopefully maybe even getting them on to talk about their mission and where they're going with St. Louis and their mission for Switch Coffee. But for right now, check out Switch Coffee at switchcoffee.co. These guys are awesome.
And purchase some coffee. It's phenomenal.
It is great.
High quality.
So let's get to our verse for today, and then we'll dive a little bit into our topic today and why we brought our guest on to talk through that with us. So we're going to be reading from John 17, verses 14 through 24. About the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and began teaching. The Jews therefore marveled, saying, "How is it that this man has learning when he has never studied?" So Jesus answered them, "My teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority. The one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory, but the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and in him there is no falsehood. Has not Moses given you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. Why do you seek to kill me?" The crowd answered, "You have a demon. Who is seeking to kill you?" Jesus answered, "I did one work, and you all marvel at it. Moses gave you circumcision, not that it is from Moses, but from the fathers. And you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. If on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision so that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because of the Sabbath? I made a man's body well. Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment."
Amen.
So there's an obvious divide going on here. We see it even in the beginning verses where Jesus is teaching in the temple, and the Jews come up to him, the Pharisees, they come up and they say, "How has this man have learning?" We've read in the other Gospels about people have marveled at Jesus' teaching, and many have even said, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Can anything good come out of this hometown that he's come from?" They have cast a negative judgment on Jesus already just by the fact of how he looks, of how he acts, and even how he teaches. They think, how can anyone possibly from this area have this much knowledge, have this much study about him. And Jesus kind of rebukes them and says, do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment, judge with spiritual judgment. And so that's going to be our topic today. We're going to be talking about stereotyping. So Matt, talk to us a little bit about what we're going to be diving into today.
Yeah, stereotyping is, I think, one of the biggest issues when it comes to dealing with race and racial issues, because it may not necessarily equate equally to racism, but it can fuel racism and racial thoughts. Okay. And so we want to talk about that in order to get ahead of that curve a little bit.
Yeah.
But we didn't just want it to be just you and me, because stereotyping is a very broad topic because it touches multiple people, multiple races. Yeah. And so what we want to do today is bring in a guest, our friend Samuel Yang.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us, brother.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
To be here.
Yeah. And just a little caveat. I can't even talk today. A little caveat.
A little caviar.
Why we? That sounds good.
Where?
On some Ritz crackers. I'm not even like that. But anyway, the little caveat as to why we chose Samuel today is we did a video a few months ago about racism and racial issues in the St. Louis area. Yeah. And we had Samuel on that video, kind of talking about what racism is and how the gospel changes it. And in that conversation, one of the biggest things that kept coming up and he kept bringing up and just had a lot of insight on just in the brief conversations we had was this issue of stereotyping and how in his life and in everyone's life we all face stereotyping. Yeah. So as soon as this topic comes up, I'm like, we have to have Samuel on this podcast. Yeah. We have to chop it up with him. And so I'm ready to get into it. But we know Samuel. You and I know Samuel. You guys are in the same gospel community.
We've known him for years.
I used to live with this guy, but the audience may not know him. So Samuel, man, let people know who you are. Like, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, what you're doing now, things like that.
Yeah. So my name is Samuel. I originally was born and raised in Florida, and when I was 14, I moved to Alabama and lived there for about 8 years before I came here to St. Louis, which has been really awesome. I'm currently a grad student at WashU at Washington University in St. Louis, and I'm studying public health with kind of an emphasis on place and space and how where you live affects the health that you experience. And in St. Louis especially, I think that really gets tied up into issues of race, issues of stereotyping and things like that. For those of you listening at home, I am also Asian American, so I guess that wasn't super obvious until now. But so I am Asian American. My parents were immigrants to America and were naturalized as citizens after I was born. But yeah, so that's definitely been a huge part of my life experience as well. Is probably one of the reasons that this is something that is really important to me, and so I'm really excited to come here and talk about it, to hopefully bring some of my perspective to that conversation.
Absolutely. So talk to us a little bit about your testimony. Did you grow up in church? How did you come to Christ in those years growing up?
Yeah, so my parents are really, really awesome. They're believers and did a great job kind of building a Christian foundation and a Christian home for me to grow up in. And so I grew up going to church and became a Christian at a really young age. And then around the time that I went to college, really started to have questions about that and started to really consider whether that was something for me. And I came pretty close to wanting to walk away, or I definitely got to the point of wanting to walk away, but I was still around people that expected me to go to church, which I'm really thankful for. I think the Lord was really gracious in making sure that I stayed connected to a Christian community even through my times of doubt. And so I eventually did come back, and it was really, really great. It was that kind of moment of taking ownership of your own faith and really realizing that it doesn't have nearly as much to do with me as I thought it did, as it was all about just really surrendering and letting the Lord be in control of my life from there on out. And so it definitely has, it's not a instant, salvation is instant, but there's so much learning that has to happen after that. So still in that process, but a lot of that has happened since moving to St. Louis, just because of the really awesome community here at August Gate and the really awesome learning experiences that I've had through most parts of my life here, really. So
yeah, that's awesome. So we brought Samuel on because again, like Matt said, he has a lot of insight into this issue of stereotyping. It's a part of things that he is studying as a part of school, and it's something that he is becoming more well-versed in day by day. And so he's a perfect person to come in and talk about stereotyping and what that looks like, not just for the black and white divide here in St. Louis, but also for the Asian American divide, as we're going to be diving into that a little bit later. So I guess the first question we want to dive into, as someone who grew up in the South, who came to St. Louis, has there been any hurdles that you faced as a minority?
Yeah. I mean, I don't. I don't necessarily know if I want to lump everything under hurdles, but I think that it becomes a defining part of your life experience when you are not the majority, and that's just kind of how things work. But I definitely think it's been something that I've been very aware of my whole life, either subconsciously or just very overtly. But yeah, I think at some point that becomes a part of the way you see the world, and I definitely have at times really just thought of myself as like an outsider, or really thought of myself as being not sure where I fit in, because I was like a minority, I guess, in the sense that I didn't share some like very visible, obvious things in common with the majority of people that I was surrounded by. And so
no, I think that's good. So coming from that to St. Louis, where there's obviously a huge difference between black and white. There's literally almost a city line. There's a line you could draw in the city of black and white.
Right.
What did that look like coming from where you were in Alabama to St. Louis as an Asian American?
Well, not that different.
Okay.
I mean, it's not that there was a huge Asian American community or some kind of bizarre like white Asian divide in Alabama. You would have heard about it by now if that was the case. But But yeah, no, I think for me, it has been a question of, it's been so exciting to walk into this conversation that people are having, especially recently, to walk into this conversation that people are having around race, but then still having some trouble figuring out, where do I fit into this conversation? I know for a fact that this is relevant to me. I know I have a stake in this, but I'm not exactly sure what the issues and the stances and the things, like we were talking about earlier. There's no like committee on this. There's no, I don't get a newsletter that says like, the Asian Americans have decided this is how we feel about something. And so it's that matter of finding a network, and I think everybody should do some of that on your own. A lot of that opinion forming, a lot of that learning happens on an individual level, but it can be hard sometimes to look into something I care so much about and not know, where's my foothold here? Where do I start off? And so like I know I was talking to somebody the other day about like one of the issues that I think is really important, has been talked about a lot recently, is representation, and like kind of giving people role models that look like them, and that was something that I really care about as an Asian American. But I remember having a conversation once where I was just like, I just feel like it's not the time for that. Like there's like there's like life or death situations happening right now. I don't really know when I'm supposed to bring this up. I feel like I only have so much energy. Like we as a society only have so much collective energy to give towards an issue. And I was just telling someone like, I don't know when this is something that I'm gonna be able to address. And they were like, well, I think we have attention. I think we have, enough energy to give to all kinds of issues, and these issues all go together, and so it's okay to talk about more than one at once. But just little conversations like that of me trying to figure out, like when is the right time, when's the right place, who are the right people. That can be challenging.
Yeah. Well, I think you kind of touched on it a little bit in that we all have these issues that we're trying to deal with when it comes to race and racial issues. And so, like, for you personally, have you ever faced racism, just straight up racism, like about you, like towards you, any kind of way? And what did that look like? Because I think we already mentioned, like, we have the black and white, like, divide and racial issues. But like, as an Asian American, what kind of racism have you faced?
I mean,
to your point, like, for defining racism. If you guys need a definition of racism, go back and listen to our first episode where we kind of defined racism and talked about it through the gospel perspective as an intentional or unintentional act where you are negatively judging or uplifting your own culture or ethnicity above another one's. And so I think that's going to be important for a definition of racism. But I don't want to cut you off, but I think that's an important definition to add to that, of like, what is racism? What does that look like? And from your experience, have you experienced anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. And I think an interesting like distinction that you were just making is kind of that negative judgment. And so I think what's cool about this conversation about stereotyping and I guess profiling is another word that gets thrown in there too, is kind of this idea that they're not always immediately obviously negative judgments, right? So people are just drawing lines of some kind. There's some kind of divide now, and it's not clear necessarily that it's like one is higher than the other. Oftentimes I think underneath it there definitely is a uplifting of your own point of view that would qualify as racism, but sometimes it really is just this like neutral divide that happens. And I think a lot of what I've experienced definitely falls into that category of stereotyping and profiling, what some people would call microaggressions, just kind of this. I think I am in a lot of situations unintentionally sometimes made to just kind of be reminded subtly that, I am not like the other people in an interaction, that I, do have something different that I can't control.
What's an example of something that you've experienced in terms of microaggression or in terms of stereotyping or profiling?
So I think a big one is just assumptions that get made about me.
Okay.
So I actually a funny example of one that I think is not necessarily like one that I would use as a textbook example.
Sure.
But one time I was leaving Walmart and they were checking receipts at the door, and I like was digging through my bag trying to find my receipt because I didn't realize they were going to do that. And the woman checking the receipts looked at me and was like, "Don't worry, I'm not looking for you." And it was just this like wink, wink. And I was like, you know what? I could steal stuff. Like, first of all, I am very hurt that you don't think that I could get away, with this bag of groceries that I just shoplifted.
I'm offended you stereotyped me that I couldn't steal.
As you stereotyped me, yeah. But like that's kind of what I was saying about, But it also is a situation of, in that moment I was kind of like subtly like made aware again, that like when she looked at me, she had, she very much picked up on the fact that. And like, obviously I'm maybe might have been because I was young, or it might have been because I was whatever. But
yeah.
But at some point she looked at me and decided there was something about me. I don't know if it was racial, I don't know, whatever. But she couldn't have said that without having decided some things about me that she did not know. And in this case, she decided a good thing, I guess. And so I'm not exactly I wasn't like, no, check my receipt. But little situations like that where you kind of get reminded, like, oh, people have thoughts that run through their head about me before they even get to know me. And I do think that is a thing that happens way beyond race. I mean, like you hear, young people complain about that, old people complain about that, people of, every like personal quality that we have eventually gets tied to something like that.
Yeah, so talk to us a little bit about the word microaggression. I think you brought that up in your response to that, and I think that could be a politically loaded term especially in our climate today. You go on Twitter, you see people abusing and misusing the word microaggression. So is there a way that we can define microaggression well? Do you have a definition that we can work off of for that?
Yes, well, Google does.
Okay.
And Google went with something that I think the three adjectives they went with were subtle, sometimes unintentional, and indirect. So it's I think it still does fall into your like broad definition of racism, but it does fall outside of what a lot of people perceive as kind of that very aggressive, direct racism that gets people very defensive. Like microaggressions kind of fall just outside of that to that zone where no one is totally sure if it happened or not, and it can be something that somebody didn't even mean. It kind of sprung out of a stereotype that they had in their head, and they just kind of said it based off of that and didn't even realize necessarily that it was happening. And that's kind of one of the it bums me out that it's already become so politically charged, because when I first learned the word a couple of years ago, I was so excited just to have a word for these kind of things that I was experiencing, because I just didn't, there was a time where I went through where I was like, I think it's just in my head. Like I'm not, I don't have the ability to point to what's happening and say like, oh, someone discriminated or it's racism or whatever. I didn't have a word for it. And when I finally learned that word, I was like, okay, there is a word for kind of that little moment of when someone just very subtly, unintentionally, indirectly says something that just, exposes a little bit of a divide between us.
Yeah. Cool. So you talked about how you kind of, when you first started, you heard the word, it was a good definition for what you were experiencing.
Right.
And unfortunately now I think it's become such a weird nebulous term now that people misuse and abuse the term, where actual committees do sit down in colleges and figure out what's a microaggression, what's this and that. So I think a lot of from what I've been reading online and researching this topic is a concern that I've seen from people in the terms of microaggression. And we don't have to make the whole episode about this, but just talking about, do you think there's a concern when microaggressions are considered to be subjective? Like, there's obviously a subjectivity to racism at some points. You have, I think we talked about this in the first episode, there's conscious and subconscious racism. The subconscious are the things that we're arguing about, that we're trying to discuss and figure out on our own. There's a subjectivity to microaggressions. Does that help it? Does that hinder it? I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think subjectivity is definitely there. I think it's important to acknowledge that there is a level of perception that just is not going to ever be able to be proved or disproved. But at the same time, I don't think that makes it somehow invalid that there is subjectivity, And so I think what can be damaging sometimes about our approach to microaggressions is that we somehow expect to live in a world without them. And when you get into this point of like, we have to either not have any at all, or we just have to say they're all fine, that's really dangerous. I think getting to the point where we say like, okay, they do happen, but each one is an opportunity to have a conversation about like, where did this come from?
Yeah.
Where is it going?
Yeah.
Cotton Eye Joe. But just kind of this, they're subjective, but I think when that is itself a conversation starter. If you say something and I subjectively decide that it was quote unquote offensive, the issue doesn't become, was that offensive? The issue becomes, well, why did we perceive that differently?
Sure.
So the issue isn't, that we have different standards for what's right or wrong. Well, actually, that is the issue. So the issue isn't whether it was right or wrong. The issue is that we somehow suddenly had different standards.
Yeah.
And especially as Christians, I think we need to be responsible and sit down and reconcile that.
I think that's a really good point because as we've kind of talked about a little bit, microaggressions appear to be the application or the outflow of a mindset of stereotyping. So let's talk about stereotyping. What is stereotyping? What does that actually mean?
Yeah, I think stereotypes are, I think you use this elsewhere, but, stereotypes are kind of a social science version of just classifying, which is kind of I think a natural reaction that we just have as people to things. It actually makes sense. Like if you were to suddenly slap me in the face right now, I wouldn't want to be like, okay, well, let's talk about this. I don't have any preconceived notions about why you slapped me. I would like immediately go to like, I am classifying you as angry and this needs to be addressed, that. So it's not like totally a useless thing. The problem is that we start to apply it to things that we don't know are true, things that we may know are not true, but it just makes more sense. And I think on a sinful level, it becomes a way that we kind of assert control over uncertain situations because we just are uncomfortable with not knowing things, and it becomes easier for us to just put a stereotype on something and it becomes more comfortable, it becomes more comprehensible for us. But I think that's really dangerous. I think, as Christians, when we stereotype someone, we in some ways take over some authorship of their story, and that's something that belongs to the Lord, and then secondarily belongs to them. That they have, the Lord has the power and the desire to work through them in a wide range of ways, and we suddenly decide through a stereotype oftentimes that there is a limited number of ways in which we think we can see the Lord working through them, or that a limited number of things that we think we can see them doing. Period. And that becomes really dangerous, I think.
That's good.
So, going off of that, obviously you talk about social sciences and how people naturally are bent to categorizing people. They're naturally bent towards placing people in groups and categories. That's just how we naturally were tribal in that area. But are there such things as good stereotypes? So for instance, there's this thing in social sciences called stereotype accuracy, where stereotypes based on gender can be good. So like for instance, men are generally physically stronger than women. That's just a generally true good stereotype that we categorize people in. But we've seen that those stereotypes can break down when you start judging people based off of their ethnicity or their nationality. So is there a balance? Are there good stereotypes that we can use? Are there helpful ones? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's still dangerous because I think even good stereotypes have a dark side, have a flip side that can then be used in a negative way. And I think there's actually some pretty concrete examples of that happening. So, for instance, so do you mean good stereotypes in the sense of good as in true or good as in like positive?
Probably more in the terms of like these are true things about people based on actual data, actual research.
I think that's a good question you asked there, because there are true stereotypes that affect, kind of like the one you mentioned there of men being stronger. That's true. Like generally men are stronger than women. That's a true one. I think also the question of good as in positive. I think that's where things start to get a little waning, because speaking from an African American perspective, there are good stereotypes of athleticism being prominent in African Americans. Okay. But you can also trace that back to them saying we're nothing more than beasts of the land, because we are more physically fit to do that kind of work. Yeah. So that can translate over to the whole thing with sports and athletics. And so making the assumption that black person is good at basketball or football because it's like, oh, you were just really good at basketball. But then when something happens when like LeBron James or someone starts to speak more in politics, and then news people start to say, just stick to sports, don't try to be political. That's just not them saying like, don't talk. They're saying, hey, you're outside of your stereotype in a sense. Yeah,
and I guess one of the things that makes me slightly leery of true stereotypes is that I'm not really sure what their utility is. So, so yes, physically men tend to be stronger than women, but what are we really doing with that information that's positive? Are we, like, oh, good, we no longer, force women to compete in weightlifting competitions against men. I'm not really sure like what we're using that information for, except that there is the flip of that, which is that women are weaker than men, and that does get used in a lot of situations. And so so I'm not really sure if there's that many examples of us taking a true fact or a true stereotype and then suddenly like, and we've talked about this for 5 minutes, so I'm sure someone, could come up with a great example of this, but I don't know that would be the norm.
I think those are really, really good points. What is the net positive outcome of using this stereotype? Are you just saying it to say it? Yeah. Or are there actual things you're trying to say through it? So I guess like you were talking about, Matt, when it comes to, and even to you, Samuel, when it comes to race, you guys talked about stereotyping being dangerous. So and you kind of touched on that a little bit. So maybe to you both, why is stereotyping dangerous, or how can it be dangerous?
Well, I do want to touch, I guess, a little bit on the idea of good, positive stereotypes that can still be dangerous, because I do think that is something that gets thrown out there. And from an Asian American perspective, a lot of people might say, like, well, what do you have to complain about? Because the stereotypical phrase for Asian Americans is model minority, right? It's the idea that we are, the most productive and
touch on it.
The most, the best of the minorities, which again has that dark side flip of like, well, if you're the model minority, then who's the not model minority? But even walking away from that, even those good stereotypes can be used in a harmful way, and I think a lot of times we need to be really aware of those to make sure that people don't let themselves off the hook for like, well, I didn't say anything bad about you, like, and two like kind of concrete examples I can think of for that, or that one. So that they've done some research, and it kind of shows that Asian Americans tend to do really well in jobs. They tend to be very productive, and the stereotype is that they are very good workers, that they're smart, they're they're competent, but they also tend to be kind of underrepresented in management level activities, and and part of that is potentially there's no way to prove these kind of things, but there is kind of the stereotype that Asian Americans and Asians in general are great workers but not great leaders, and so there kind of becomes this ceiling where your good stereotype of Asian Americans are good workers suddenly hits the top of the good stuff, and then hits and then goes through into the bad stuff, which is that, well, the flip of that is that they're good workers but they're not actually great leaders, and so there becomes what they call the bamboo ceiling, which is funny, but
wow.
But
I never knew that one.
There's that. So, and then another one that I think is even more is more substantiated and potentially much more harmful is that there is a stereotype, like you were saying earlier, of African Americans or of Black people being stronger somehow. And they've noticed that in a lot of pain management, Blacks tend to get less attention and management of their pain. They tend to expect, especially kids, to have like superhuman pain tolerance. And they've done the studies to show that a lot of times doctors just have like really off perceptions, stereotypes about who needs pain medicine. And so that becomes really dangerous in the medical field when you have unequal amounts of attention being given to people that need the same resources.
And we'll be linking to these resources in the show notes, so you guys can take a look at the research for yourself, because I think those are really important things for us to discuss and dissect on our own. So I guess just to put it out there, are stereotypes racist? Are they racist?
I think the short answer is yes, but I think we just also need a better kind of vocabulary around racism. We need a slightly richer set of words to work with here, because it's a continuum, right? So is it racism in the sense that like Jim Crow was racism? Like, no. Right. But was it a part of Jim Crow? I mean, did Jim Crow involve stereotypes? Like, absolutely, you know? And so I think people, especially once you hit racism, people go to like 100 immediately. They go straight to the worst possible outcome, and they say, well, no, it's not that. And you're right, it's not that. But is it still on that spectrum? Like, yeah, I would definitely say it is. Is it a race-based treatment of someone that still has negative consequences? Yes. I mean, I think we've already actually run through a couple examples of that. And so, I think we need to maintain that connection between the two, but also, we can't acknowledge that they're not the same thing.
Yeah, I want to build off that a little bit and say I would say stereotyping is either the fall off of a racial connection or the seeds to begin racism.
Yes, yeah.
I always think of this picture of a tree. Like, and it had seeds in there, and the tree is racism. Like, it has different branches, different parts, and like, how does a tree, like, it spreads its seed? So either it's a fall off from it, and it has the potential to become racism, but we don't think of it as racism because we're not, like you said, to the max or to the extreme versions of racism. I'll say it may not be directly that kind of racism, but it definitely has this potential to grow into a racial thought or racial issues. Yeah.
So then I think, going off of that, coming from a white perspective into this, it could be hard to kind of process something as being that's racist, because I think we've seen a lot of people unfortunately misuse the word racism, and they don't necessarily define that clearly. And that's why I think in our definition we've included intentional but also unintentional things as well, because I think that could be hard, at least for a lot of white people, to understand, is that, if I say something to Sammy like, I'm trying to think of like a Asian American stereotype.
Like, what's offensive enough to be an example, but not offensive enough to have to be edited out?
Trying to walk that tightrope. But if I say like, oh, Samuel, you're really good at playing an instrument, like that, I think that's a stereotype of Asian Americans, that they're really good at playing instruments. But for me, like, I don't think that's racist. If I would say something like that. Now, looking back, it's like, oh, maybe that's built upon a stereotype made upon your nationality, upon your ethnicity. But I think making it clear for people that there is this conscious but subconscious racism, because if we believe racism is a sin, which it is, sin affects the heart so deeply. And like you talk about the tree, the roots go so deep that we may not even understand or even realize. This is why David prays, save me from the unintentional sins, of the sins that I'm not even aware of. That's what he prays in the Psalms. And going into it, I think it's good to talk about, like, it is racism, but you're right, there is a continuum, but it's still racism, and it's still a part of the sinful fallen nature that we have in all of us.
And I want to say, like, I think with stereotypes, with like the example that you just gave, it has a lot to do with what you actually know versus what you assumed. And so, especially as Christians, I think it's important to have that posture of humility when you're approaching others. And so, you know, I've had people say like, oh, you're really good at playing an instrument to me. And that's because I am. And so I don't care like that. If you heard me play an instrument and then you tell me that, like, I appreciate that. That's not offensive.
Okay.
What I have had people do is ask me if I played an instrument. And then when I said yes, this actually has happened countless times, people say, of course. Or they say, oh, I thought so. And that at that point, then I'm like, okay, well, there clearly was something you did not know, but you had your like guess, and that's when it gets to that point of like, oh wait, there is, you know, something happening below the surface here that maybe I would not appreciate. In this case, it's harmless. Like, I don't really care that you assume I played an instrument. Yeah. But what else is attached to that? What other things are you also thinking and you're waiting to confirm? You know.
So I got a question off of that. Whenever that's happened, have you ever addressed that person when that has happened? Like they did that to you, and if you did, was their response is you're too sensitive?
Well, I think I probably got that the first few times I did it, so I probably have stopped. I don't usually like stop the conversation and do anything about it, but I do make faces. I feel like if you know me, or even if you don't know me, and you get hit with a facial expression from me after you say something like that, usually I think people are like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have done that.
Right.
But yeah, no, for sure, I've had things like that, and a couple that were slightly more egregious, where I would be like, I kind of wish that you hadn't gone there, and you know, they'd be like, oh, well, you know, based on my past experience, I just thought, you know, or based on, I just kind of thought that, you know, and it's hard to argue with that because it's like, well, they were right, so, you know, what am I gonna and that's kind of where we go back and loop back a little bit into that microaggression thing, where like no one can really prove that it happened. You know, they were right. They had a little bit of like they had a 3-person sample size they were working off of before. They are now 4 on Asians that play instruments. You know, like what am I gonna do about that? And so it's a tricky. It's harder to have, I think, a conversation about that because I'm not gonna like pull out a flow chart. You know.
Yeah, I think the reason why I ask that is sometimes I hear these stories about people addressing like stereotyping a little bit, and then the response to that is, like, you're just being hypersensitive to this. I wasn't trying to be racist, but I think you're just being really hypersensitive, and your feelings are getting hurt too easy. We're in this a soft generation, I guess you can say, and so I just kind of begin. Are we too sensitive? Are we hypersensitive about stereotyping? So, like, for instance, comedians. Like, I listen to a lot of comedians from different races and nationalities, and a lot of them talk about racial issues in their comedic stand-ups or whatnot. And so people like, well, like so-and-so does a stand-up about racial issues. We tell jokes about racial issues. Are we just being too sensitive about stereotyping? So just kind of like off that, are we too sensitive, or are we trying to tap into something that hasn't been really addressed? What do you think about that?
What's your snowflake meter?
Right.
Yeah, well, that's what I was trying to think of. Snowflake generation.
So the meter, I mean, that's a good word to use because I do think we have to understand, like, I don't want people, when I react to someone stereotyping me, I'm not reacting to them with the same level of intensity that I would react if they like took away my right to vote, you know, like, and I think people do. I think one of the reasons people get so defensive or confused around stereotypes is because they think that I am. They think that I'm like, when they say something that's just like racially tinged, you know, and I give them a little bit of pushback, they think that I'm going. They get like, oh no, it's not like that, you know. And we all know what that is, right? They're like, oh well, I didn't mean it like that, and I'm like, I didn't mean it like that either. You know, I'm not actually trying to have that full out conversation either. I just want to talk about, you know, we're gonna both go to 20 right now, and we're gonna hang out there for a little bit and talk about, you know, what was happening there. No, neither of us has to go all the way to 100 right now. I recognize that, and you recognize that too, which is why you're getting nervous because you don't want that to happen, and I know it too. So I think that's important. But I actually I try to employ what I call the Yo Mama rule when it comes to things like this, and it's not just for race. This started for me with being from having grown up in the South, and you know, I come up here now and people suddenly want to talk trash about the South like the rest of the U.S. has it together, right? So the way that I like to do it is I say, like, you know, you get to talk about, you know, this is maybe not the most Christian thing, but you get to talk about your mom differently than somebody else gets to talk about your mom, right? That's why Yo Mama jokes are like offensive. It's because somebody else usually doesn't get to say stuff like that about your mom,
right?
You know, and so just because you know, like if I see somebody else from the South and we both want to sit around and talk about our issues with the South, that's one thing. But then somebody else wants to step up, you know, and they want to talk about the South too. I'm like, well, wait, that's that's where I'm from. And it matters. I think people get offended because they're like, oh, I don't get to be a part of this conversation. But I'm like, that happens all the time. That happens with your mom. Like, I have friends all the time who, I mean, my mom is great, but I have friends who want to tell me about how their mom is crazy. And I'll sit there, I'll listen. I'll be like, yeah, your mom's crazy, man. But as soon as I want to participate, they're like, whoa, hold on, that's my mom. Like, you can't talk about my mom like that.
Yeah.
And so I think that's true. I think it's true of a lot of things, that you get to have a conversation differently depending on your proximity to it. So I think that applies here as much as it applies to other personality traits that people may have.
Yeah. I want to actually hear your perspective on this a little bit, Jake, because I think this is one of the questions you wrote down. Do you think, coming from a white perspective, that people are hypersensitive to the whole stereotyping thing? Or do you think that... No, I mean, this is a real conversation.
Yeah.
So I would love to hear your perspective on that.
I think it just depends. I think it's a situational thing. Like, I'm on Twitter a lot, scrolling through the news feeds, and I definitely think there are people who are so sensitive to different things. I think we even joked about this on Breakfast on Friday of the Bruno Mars cultural appropriation thing. Like, is Bruno Mars culturally appropriating black culture into his music? Is he just being ambiguous? And to me, like, I just, as someone who just like stepped into that conversation, I think it looks silly from the outside. Yeah. Looking into it, but I'm not involved in those conversations deeply. But to me, that seemed silly. Yeah. Too sensitive to talk about those things, and I think that people can become so sensitive that it can affect outcomes where we can't really say certain things about things where speech can be, shut down. Like for instance, if we want to notice the inherent, that's why I brought up the gender differences in terms of strength. Like, if we want to notice and say, because our culture says there's no differences between genders, but if I want to say, oh, there are actually biological differences between male and female, that gets shut down because that's a microaggression against women, and that's a microaggression against trans LGBT people, and so I think that we're moving in a direction of becoming too hypersensitive. If that makes sense, to certain topics where everything, and maybe this is an unfounded fear, and you guys can touch on this. Are we moving towards something where we're becoming too hypersensitive to microaggressions? Are we miscategorizing things that are just truth, and we're saying they're microaggressions, so we can't talk about them? What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I would say that in a sense we are being too sensitive. Okay. If everything offends us right off the back. Okay. So I love the example that you used, the yo mama thing, because like I had a similar thought earlier when it comes to my siblings, right? Like I will like rag on my siblings. We will joke back and forth, call each other names. Like we had like legitimate fights. We won't like talk to each other, be mad. Yeah. But the moment someone else steps up to us, like one of our siblings outside our family, we're like, whoa, no, that's my blood. You can't cross that line. And so, is that being hypersensitive? No, that's a familial thing. There's a connection. There's a relationship. And so one of the things like I kind of put in that mindset is, if you can't say that joke or that stereotype or do that microaggression to a brother or sister in Christ to their face, that may be something that you might not want to do or say. You know what I mean? Yeah. Does that make sense? Because I'm gonna just be real. Like, I make jokes all the time. Like, me and Samuel used to live together. We used to talk about stereotypes and joke about racial issues. All right. Yeah. We did that, but that's because we had a relationship. Yeah. There are things that I won't say to Samuel because I know that they're offensive. Sure. I know that they are negative, or even if they're positive, they're not helpful stereotypes or helpful jokes when it comes to growing the body of Christ. And so there has to be a good check and balance with that. But I think one of the things I've always had to put before myself is that if I say this, could I say this to my brother Samuel, or could I say this to Jake to his face? Yeah. If I can't say to your face, then I shouldn't say it at all. Right. So I don't know. What about you, Samuel?
I think with hypersensitivity, there's kind of two aspect that you want to look at in terms of identification and reaction, right? So
Okay.
as far as reaction, like, yeah, we are hypersensitive if we're cutting it all off, if we're saying every time there is a microaggression, this conversation has to end, or there has to be some kind of punishment, or there has to be some kind of, immediate scrubbing out of its existence.
Sure.
That is a problem. And which I still would argue, how much of it, if this is, but if what you're saying on Twitter is the most accurate representation of how we as a society are reacting to microaggressions,
That's good, yeah.
then yeah, we're hypersensitive in that aspect. But as far
That's
as
good.
identifying, I don't know that we are hypersensitive in identifying microaggressions. And for better or for worse, when they happen, they need to be addressed. If you think that I hit your car, and so because of that you key my car, I can't undo all of those actions
Yeah.
just because I never hit your car.
Right.
Those things happen. They need to be addressed,
Yeah.
And so if someone thinks that I committed a microaggression against them, even if what I did wasn't really a microaggression, there's still a level of that has to be worked through. There's still a conversation that needs to be had, and that doesn't go away just because we're less sensitive now. And so I think, kind of the compromise that we could maybe make, not we as in like you're white and I'm not, but like
Right.
the compromise that could be made around, this is that, maybe we do modulate our intensity around our reactions, so we say, okay, let's have a more, let's think about ways that we can react that aren't as sensitive, but also, let's be open to them existing. Let's be willing to say like, okay, that was a microaggression. Even if it wasn't, we should probably still talk about it because you took it some kind of way that I didn't say it. And so that's kind of a thing that I think, we need to still stay vigilant to identifying microaggressions
No, it's helpful,
while
yeah.
also being, all holding each other accountable to reacting in an appropriate way.
Yeah,
if that makes
absolutely.
sense.
No, I think that's super helpful. And we're actually going to have to keep continuing on this conversation into another episode. This is just part one of our episode talking about stereotyping, about microaggression. We'll be diving into a lot more questions and even the application in our next episode coming up in part 2. So guys, be on the lookout for that. We have there's a lot more to say about this, and we have a lot more thoughts on this, and how we as Christians should be approaching how we should be approaching the topic of stereotyping and microaggression, and how we could be thinking about it from a Christian worldview. But Samuel, I want to thank you for being here for part 1 of this episode. We really appreciate your honesty and being here with us, and like Matt said, chopping it up with us about stereotyping. So I want to encourage you guys to leave an honest 5-star review on iTunes. This really helps people find us when they're searching for us. You can head over to our Facebook page and like us for updates about our podcast. We're doing some crowdfunding, so make sure you guys take a look out for that. I want to thank our sponsors, JM Films, for all of your film and video needs. All of your film and video, every single one of them. Check out jmfilms.com. I want to thank our sponsors, Switch Coffee, for delivering some holla praise for the Switch Coffee. Just head on over to switchcoffee.co and order some coffee. This episode was produced by Nick Francis and was mixed by David Butler here in August Gate Studios. So that's it for this episode of Coffee and Cream. We will see you for part 2 of Stereotyping.